October 3rd, 1935. Dawn breaks over the ancient highlands of Ethiopia. In the northern town of Adwa, merchants open their shops. Farmers tend their terraced fields. Children walk to school. The morning seems like any other. Then, at exactly 5 a.m., the sky fills with the roar of engines. Italian bombers appear over the horizon, dozens of them, flying in tight formation. The first bombs fall. Buildings explode. People run screaming through the streets. The ancient kingdom of Ethiopia, independent for over 2,000 years, is under attack. What followed was not just another colonial war, another chapter in Europe's scramble for Africa. This was something different, something darker. This was a preview of the horrors that would consume the entire world within 4 years. This was total war brought to Africa. Poison gas deployed against defenseless villages, aerial bombardment of hospitals and Red Cross stations, systematic massacre of civilians, and the complete catastrophic failure of the international community to stop naked aggression. This is the story of how Benito Mussolini's imperial dreams collided with one man's belief in international justice. This is the story of how the world stood by and watched a sovereign nation be destroyed. And this is the story of why, when we speak of the road to World War II, that road begins here in the highlands of Ethiopia. To understand this war, we must first understand what Ethiopia represented. This was no ordinary nation. Ethiopia's history stretched back into biblical times. The Ethiopians traced their dynasty to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether myth or truth, the claim spoke to a civilization of incredible age and pride. When Rome was still a collection of villages, Ethiopia was already a kingdom. When Charlemagne ruled Europe, Ethiopian kings commanded vast territories. Ethiopian Christianity was among the oldest in the world, dating to the 4th century, before most of Europe was converted. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from solid stone in the 12th century, rivaled any European cathedral. Ethiopian monks preserved ancient manuscripts through the centuries. Their religious art, their music, their traditions were unique in all the world. This was not a primitive society waiting for European civilization. This was a sophisticated civilization that had flourished when Europe was emerging from the Dark Ages. By 1935, Ethiopia was a nation in transition. The capital, Addis Ababa, founded by Emperor Menelik II in 1886, was a growing modern city. Wide boulevards stretched between government buildings. The emperor's palace stood as a symbol of sovereignty. There were schools, hospitals, telephone lines. But Ethiopia remained largely rural, agricultural, traditional. Over 10 million people lived across highlands and lowlands, speaking dozens of languages, practicing ancient customs. It was a feudal empire where regional nobles, the Ras, wielded enormous power. The emperor in Addis Ababa ruled, but his authority depended on the loyalty of these great lords. Ethiopia's military reflected this feudal structure. The army was not a modern, centralized force, but a collection of regional levies. When the emperor called for war, the Ras would summon their followers, farmers who were also warriors, men who would leave their fields to fight for their lord and their land. They came with whatever weapons they possessed. Some had modern rifles, purchased from European arms dealers. Others carried weapons generations old, antique firearms, swords, spears, leather shields. They were brave, fierce, accustomed to the harsh highland terrain. But they lacked modern training, artillery, aircraft, and the logistical organization of a 20th century military. This would prove catastrophic. The man who led this ancient nation into its greatest crisis was Emperor Haile Selassie I. Born Tafari Makonnen in 1892, he had risen through intelligence and political skill. As regent from 1916 and emperor from 1930, he was a modernizer. He built schools and hospitals. He abolished slavery, a controversial move that angered traditional nobles. He joined the League of Nations in 1923, seeking international recognition and protection. He believed in progress, in international law, in the possibility that the world had moved beyond the age of imperial conquest. He was wrong, but his faith in that dream and his courage in defending it would make him one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. Mussolini's dream of empire. October 28, 1922. Benito Mussolini and his fascist blackshirts marched on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war, appointed Mussolini prime minister. Within 3 years, Mussolini had transformed Italy into a dictatorship. He called himself Il Duce, the leader. His vision was grandiose and megalomaniacal: restore the Roman Empire, make Italy a great power, dominate the Mediterranean. He filled his speeches with references to ancient Rome, to Caesar, to imperial glory. It was theater, propaganda, and deeply held belief all at once. But there was a problem. Italy's existing empire was pitiful compared to Britain or France. Italy controlled Libya in North Africa, conquered only after a brutal war with the Ottoman Empire. It held Eritrea and Italian Somaliland in East Africa, territories acquired in the scramble for Africa but economically worthless. These were not empires to rival Britain's vast holdings or France's African possessions. Worse, they reminded Italians of failure. Between Eritrea and Somaliland lay Ethiopia, independent, defiant, and the source of Italy's greatest colonial humiliation, the Shadow of Adwa, March 1, 1896. At Adwa, in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, 100,000 Ethiopian warriors faced an Italian army of 17,000. Italian commanders, arrogant and overconfident, believed African troops couldn't stand against European discipline and firepower. They were catastrophically wrong. Emperor Menelik II had modernized his army. He had purchased rifles and artillery from European arms dealers, played European powers against each other diplomatically, and mobilized a massive force. At Adwa, Ethiopian warriors attacked in coordinated waves. Italian formations broke under assault. Soldiers fled. By day's end, 6,000 Italians lay dead. 2,000 more were captured. It was the greatest defeat of a European power by an African nation in the colonial era. Ethiopia remained independent. Italy was humiliated. The news sparked riots in Italian cities. The government fell. For a generation of Italians, Adwa was a wound that never healed, a national humiliation that demanded revenge. Mussolini, who was 13 when Adwa occurred, grew up in this atmosphere of shame and desire for vindication. When he came to power, avenging Adwa became an obsession. He would succeed where his predecessors had failed. He would conquer Ethiopia. He would have his empire. The League of Nations, a dream of peace. January 10, 1920. The League of Nations held its first meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. It was humanity's greatest attempt to prevent war through international cooperation. Born from the ashes of World War I, which had killed over 10 million people, the League embodied a revolutionary idea. Nations would collectively guarantee each other's sovereignty. If one nation attacked another, all League members would respond, first with economic sanctions, then, if necessary, with military force. Aggression would be punished. Peace would be maintained through collective security. It was a beautiful vision, but it had critical weaknesses. The United States, whose President Woodrow Wilson had championed the League, never joined. The Senate rejected membership. The Soviet Union was excluded until 1934. Germany, the defeated aggressor of World War I, wasn't admitted until 1926. The League had no standing army, no enforcement mechanism beyond the willingness of member nations to act. It could pass resolutions, impose sanctions, condemn aggression, but it could not force compliance. Everything depended on moral authority and the commitment of powerful nations, primarily Britain and France, to uphold collective security. When those nations chose their own interests over principle, the League was powerless. In 1923, Ethiopia joined the League of Nations. It was one of only 4 independent African nations at the time, the others being Liberia, South Africa, and Egypt. For Haile Selassie, League membership meant protection. Ethiopia was surrounded by European colonies, British Kenya and Sudan, French Somaliland, Italian Eritrea, and Somaliland. League membership, Selassie believed, would guarantee Ethiopian sovereignty. The international community would never allow a League member to be conquered. This faith in international law would be tested and destroyed within 12 years. The Wall Incident, Manufacturing a War. December 5, 1934. Wall, a remote oasis in the Ogaden Desert on the disputed border between Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland. The border had never been properly demarcated. Both Italy and Ethiopia claimed the area. An Ethiopian escort accompanying a British boundary commission arrived at Wall to find Italian troops and Somali soldiers in Italian service already there, fortifications constructed, the Italian flag flying. For 5 days, both sides faced off. Tensions mounted. On December 5th, someone fired a shot. Accounts differ on who fired first. Within minutes, a full battle erupted. Italian aircraft appeared. Ethiopia had no air force. Machine guns raked Ethiopian positions. When the fighting ended, estimates suggest 150 Ethiopians were dead, along with 50 Italian colonial troops and 30 Italian officers. It was a minor border clash, the kind that occurred regularly in colonial territories. But Mussolini saw his opportunity. Italian propaganda transformed Wall into an outrage. Headlines screamed of Ethiopian aggression. Mussolini demanded an apology and financial compensation, demands he knew Ethiopia couldn't accept without humiliation. Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations for arbitration under Article 5 of the League Covenant, which called for peaceful settlement of disputes. The League created a commission of inquiry. Diplomats talked, meetings were scheduled, and while they talked, Mussolini prepared for war. The drums of war. Throughout early 1935, Italy mobilized for war on a scale unprecedented in colonial history. Ships departed Italian ports daily, bound for Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. They carried tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft, machine guns, millions of rounds of ammunition, medical supplies, construction equipment, and mountains of food and water. Entire airfields were shipped in pieces and assembled in East Africa. Roads were constructed, supply depots established. The logistics were staggering, supporting a modern army thousands of miles from Italy, across desert and mountain, in climates that ranged from scorching lowlands to cold highlands. And the troops came, regular Italian army divisions, fascist militia blackshirt battalions, Eritrean and Somali colonial units called Askari. They trained in Eritrea and Somaliland for months, acclimatizing to the heat, learning the terrain. By September 1935, 400,000 Italian and colonial troops were positioned on Ethiopia's borders, the largest colonial army ever assembled. They had 300 tanks, over 700 artillery pieces, and nearly 400 aircraft. The disparity in firepower was overwhelming. The world watched this massive buildup with growing alarm. The Italian preparations were undisguised. Mussolini wanted the world to see his power. Britain and France, the dominant League powers, faced a dilemma. They needed Italian support against Nazi Germany, which was rearming in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler had withdrawn Germany from the League and was openly defying international treaties. Britain and France calculated that keeping Italy as an ally against Germany was more important than defending Ethiopia. It was a cynical calculation, and it would prove disastrously wrong. In Ethiopia, Haile Selassie watched the Italian buildup with dread. He appealed repeatedly to the League of Nations. He sent diplomatic missions to European capitals. He offered concessions, negotiations, anything to avoid war. But he also prepared. The emperor issued a proclamation calling all able-bodied men to defend the nation. From across Ethiopia, warriors answered the call. They came in the hundreds of thousands. Farmers left their fields. They brought whatever weapons they had, rifles if they owned them, swords and spears if they didn't. They came on horseback, on mules, on foot. Entire villages mobilized together. Priests blessed them before departure. Women ululated traditional war cries. These warriors would fight with incredible bravery, but bravery alone cannot stop bombers and tanks. The final hours of peace, September 1935. The last desperate attempts at peace. Britain and France proposed the Zala Corridor. Ethiopia would grant Italy territorial concessions and economic privileges in exchange for peace. Haile Selassie, though the terms were humiliating, considered accepting. But the proposal reached him too late, and Mussolini had already decided on war. He wanted conquest, not compromise. He wanted revenge for Adwa. He wanted his place in history as the man who restored the Roman Empire. October 2nd, 1935. From the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, Mussolini addressed a massive crowd. His voice was full of bombast and certainty. "We have been patient with Ethiopia for 40 years. Now our patience is exhausted. Sanctions? We don't care about sanctions. Italy wants peace, but is not afraid of war." The crowd roared its approval. Church bells rang across Rome. Italy was going to war. In Ethiopia that same evening, the sun set over the highlands as it had for centuries. Farmers brought their cattle in from pasture. Families gathered for evening meals. Children played in village squares. They did not know that in a few hours their world would be shattered, that within months hundreds of thousands would be dead, that their ancient independence was about to be tested as never before. The last hours of peace ticked away, and then, at dawn, the bombers came. Part 2. The Invasion. The Northern Offensive begins. October 3rd, 1935, 5 a.m. Without a declaration of war, Italian aircraft bombed the towns of Adwa and Adigrat in northern Ethiopia. Minutes later, artillery opened fire along the entire Eritrean border. Then came the ground assault. General Emilio de Bono, a gray-haired veteran of World War I and one of the original architects of fascism, commanded the Northern Army, 100,000 men organized into 3 corps. The invasion was methodical, overwhelming. In the center, the Eritrean Corps under General Alessandro Pircio Biroli advanced directly toward Adwa. On the right flank, the Second Corps moved through difficult mountain terrain. On the left, the First Corps drove through the Mareb River Valley. Italian tankettes, small, lightly armored vehicles, led the way, machine gunning Ethiopian positions. Behind them came infantry in trucks, artillery, supply columns stretching for miles. Overhead, bombers and fighters provided air cover. The Ethiopians had never seen anything like this level of mechanized warfare. Within 3 days, Adwa fell. For Mussolini, the symbolism was delicious. The site of Italy's 1896 humiliation was now in Italian hands. General de Bono entered the town in triumph, newsreel cameras recording every moment for Italian audiences. In Rome, crowds celebrated wildly, but in Ethiopia, the fall of Adwa was just the beginning of catastrophe. The Southern Front, Graziani's brutality. In the south, a different kind of war unfolded. General Rodolfo Graziani, commanding Italian forces invading from Italian Somaliland, was a man with a reputation for extreme brutality. In Libya during the 1920s, he had earned the nickname the Butcher of Libya for his ruthless suppression of resistance, concentration camps, mass executions, entire villages destroyed. Mussolini approved. Graziani was exactly the kind of commander Il Duce wanted for this war. Graziani's force was smaller than de Bono's, about 40,000 men, but no less determined. His orders were clear: advance rapidly, crush all resistance, terrorize the population into submission. Graziani followed these orders enthusiastically. His columns used poison gas from the very beginning. Italian aircraft sprayed mustard gas over Ethiopian positions, violating international treaties Italy had signed. Graziani didn't care about international law. He cared about victory and terror. Ethiopian resistance. The early battles. Despite the overwhelming Italian advantage, Ethiopian forces fought back with ferocity and courage. At Dembagina Pass, a narrow mountain corridor on the road to Axum, Ethiopian forces under Ras Seyum Mangasha ambushed an Italian column. Hidden in the rocks above the road, Ethiopian riflemen opened fire, pouring rounds into the surprised Italians below. The ambush was devastating. Hundreds of Italian soldiers were killed or wounded in the first minutes. For several hours, the Ethiopians held the pass. Italian officers called for air support. Within the hour, bombers arrived, turning the mountainside into an inferno. Ethiopian positions were obliterated from the air. What couldn't be bombed was hit with artillery once it was brought forward. The Ethiopians were forced to retreat, leaving their dead on the mountainside. But they had shown that they could fight, that they could inflict casualties. The Italians would not have an easy victory. At Amba Aradam, a steep, flat-topped mountain with commanding views of the surrounding terrain, Ethiopian forces established a major defensive position. Ras Mulugeta, one of Ethiopia's most experienced military commanders, brought 30,000 warriors to the mountain. They built stone fortifications, positioned machine guns, dug trenches. Ras Mulugeta understood that the Ethiopians' best chance was to use terrain to neutralize Italian advantages. On mountains, tanks were useless. Artillery had limited effectiveness. It would come down to men with rifles fighting from strong positions. Throughout late 1935, Italian forces made repeated attempts to take Amba Aradam. Each assault was costly. Ethiopian defenders, firing from above, cut down Italian soldiers struggling up steep slopes. Machine gun nests swept the approaches. Italian casualties mounted. But the Italians had one overwhelming advantage: aircraft. Day after day, Italian bombers pounded Amba Aradam. They dropped high explosive bombs, incendiary bombs that set fire to Ethiopian supplies, and, most horrifically, bombs filled with mustard gas. The poison gas, a crime against humanity. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had banned chemical weapons in warfare. Italy was a signatory. But Mussolini didn't care about treaties when they stood in the way of victory. In September 1935, before the invasion even began, he sent explicit orders to his commanders authorizing the use of chemical weapons. A cable to General Graziani read, "I authorize Your Excellency to use gas, even on a vast scale." To Marshal Badoglio, who would soon replace de Bono, Mussolini wrote, "All forms of gas could and should be employed." The Italians used mustard gas, the same weapon that had horrified the world during World War I. Mustard gas doesn't kill immediately. It burns. On contact with skin, it creates enormous, painful blisters. If inhaled, it destroys lung tissue. Eyes exposed to the gas are blinded. There is no quick death, only agony. And the Ethiopians had no protection, no gas masks, no chemical suits, no treatment protocols. They suffered horribly. Dr. John Melly, a British physician working with the Ethiopian Red Cross, documented the horrors. His reports described wards filled with victims, their skin covered with great yellow blisters caused by the mustard gas, many blinded, all in terrible pain. He wrote of watching strong warriors reduced to whimpering invalids, their skin burned away, their lungs destroyed. Swedish Red Cross doctors confirmed the Italian use of chemical weapons. International observers reported seeing Italian aircraft spraying liquid gas over troops and villages. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Worse, the Italians didn't limit chemical weapons to military targets. Villages were gassed. Water sources were contaminated deliberately, poisoning wells and streams that civilians depended on. Livestock died in the fields. Crops were destroyed. This wasn't just military strategy, it was systematic terror designed to break the will of the entire Ethiopian population. Between October 1935 and May 1936, Italian forces dropped over 300 tons of chemical weapons on Ethiopia. It was a massive war crime authorized at the highest levels of the Italian government. De Bono's caution and replacement. By November 1935, Mussolini was furious. General de Bono had captured Adwa, Axum, and Adigrat, but then stopped. The old general was being cautious, methodical. He wanted secure supply lines, proper logistics, time to build roads and establish supply depots before advancing further into hostile territory. It was sound military practice, but Mussolini didn't want sound military practice. He wanted rapid, dramatic victories that he could trumpet to the Italian public and the world. On November 16th, Mussolini replaced de Bono with Marshal Pietro Badoglio, a more aggressive commander with fewer scruples. Badoglio had distinguished himself in World War I and understood modern warfare. He also understood what Mussolini wanted: victory at any cost, using any means necessary. Chemical weapons? Approved. Bombing civilians? Approved. Mass reprisals? Approved. Badoglio would give Mussolini his conquest, and he wouldn't let humanitarian concerns slow him down. The Ethiopian counteroffensive: hope and despair. December 1935. Emperor Haile Selassie decided that defense alone wouldn't win the war. If Ethiopian forces remained passive, the Italians would methodically destroy them with superior firepower. The emperor planned a massive counteroffensive. 3 Ethiopian armies would converge on Italian positions simultaneously: Ras Kaassa, Haile Darje from the west, Ras Seyum Mangasha from the north, and Ras Mulugeta Yagazu from Amba Aradam. Together they commanded over 100,000 warriors. If they could coordinate their attacks, they might overwhelm Italian positions through sheer numbers. The plan was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. Ethiopian forces lacked modern communications, no radios, no telephone lines in the field. Coordination depended on runners carrying messages over mountain trails that might take days to traverse. But the emperor had few options. This would be Ethiopia's supreme effort, the moment when courage and numbers would be tested against modern firepower. December 15th, 1935. The offensive began at Dembagina Pass. Ras Kaassa's forces attacked with incredible bravery. Thousands of warriors charged Italian positions. The noise was overwhelming: rifle fire, machine guns, artillery, war cries, dying screams. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. Ethiopian warriors broke through outer defenses. Italian officers reported being nearly overrun. Then came the bombers. Italian aircraft appeared in waves, bombing and strafing the densely packed Ethiopian forces. There was nowhere to hide on the open slopes. Bombs exploded amid Ethiopian ranks, each blast killing dozens. Machine gun fire from aircraft raked the attackers. Ethiopian casualties were catastrophic. Ras Kaassa's army lost thousands in a single day. The offensive had failed before it truly began. The Battle of Amba Aradam. Crushing defeat. January 1936. Marshal Badoglio turned his attention to Amba Aradam, where Ras Mulugeta's 30,000 warriors still held their mountain fortress. Badoglio brought overwhelming force to bear: 3 Italian corps, massive artillery concentrations, and near-constant air support. His plan was methodical: Surround the mountain, bombard it into submission, then assault from multiple directions simultaneously. February 10, 1936. The bombardment began. For 5 days, Italian artillery pounded Amba Aradam. Over 200 guns fired continuously, shells screaming onto the mountain at a rate of thousands per day. The Italian military had assembled one of the largest artillery concentrations seen since World War I. The mountain shook under the impact. Dust clouds rose hundreds of feet in the air. And through it all, bombers continued their attacks, dropping high explosive and chemical weapons. On Amba Aradam, Ras Mulugeta's warriors endured hell. Stone fortifications were pulverized. Machine gun nests were obliterated. Men died by the hundreds under the ceaseless bombardment. Those who survived the explosions faced mustard gas that drifted across the mountain, burning lungs and skin. Food and water ran short. Medical supplies were exhausted. Yet the Ethiopians held their positions, firing back when Italian ground troops probed their defenses. February 15, 1936. The final assault. Italian troops attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. Ethiopian defenders, weakened by days of bombardment and gas attacks, fought desperately. Hand-to-hand combat raged across the mountain. Italian troops later reported that wounded Ethiopian warriors would fight to the last breath, attacking with swords when their rifles were empty. But numbers and firepower told. By nightfall, Amba Aradam had fallen. Ras Mulugeta attempted to lead survivors off the mountain under cover of darkness. During the retreat, his column was ambushed. The old Ras, one of Ethiopia's most respected military leaders, was killed, shot by Italian colonial troops. His body was later recovered and buried with honor by his followers. But his army was destroyed. Of the 30,000 who had held Amba Aradam, fewer than half survived. It was a crushing defeat, and it broke the back of Ethiopian resistance in the north. The Battle of Tembian and Shire. But the disaster continued. At Tembian, Ras Kassa's army, already bloodied at Dembagina, faced another Italian offensive. Again, the pattern repeated. Overwhelming artillery, aerial bombardment, chemical weapons, then ground assault. Ras Kassa fought skillfully, conducting defensive retreats, trying to preserve his forces. But he was fighting a losing battle. By late February, his army had been shattered. In the north, Ras Seyum's army, facing Marshal Badoglio's main force, was pushed back relentlessly. Town by town, position by position, the Italians advanced. By March 1936, northern Ethiopia was effectively under Italian control. 3 Ethiopian armies, over 100,000 warriors, had been destroyed. Tens of thousands were dead. The road to the Ethiopian heartland lay open. Emperor Haile Selassie's last stand, the Battle of Mechu, March 31, 1936. Emperor Haile Selassie made his final stand at Mechu. He had assembled what remained of Ethiopia's armies, perhaps 80,000 warriors, the last major force capable of resisting the Italian advance. The emperor chose his ground carefully, a series of mountains and ridges that offered excellent defensive positions. If terrain could neutralize Italian advantages in firepower and mobility, this was the place. The emperor himself took personal command, something Ethiopian monarchs rarely did. He established his headquarters on the heights where he could observe the entire battlefield. Around him gathered the remnants of Ethiopia's military aristocracy, Ras Kassa, Ras Seyum, Ras Getachew, and dozens of lesser nobles, each commanding their own contingents. They positioned their forces along the ridgelines, placed machine guns at key points, and prepared to defend their homeland. For one day, it seemed possible. Ethiopian forces held their positions against repeated Italian probes. Artillery fire, while heavy, couldn't dislodge defenders from well-chosen positions. Small-scale Italian attacks were repulsed with significant casualties. As night fell on March 31st, the Ethiopians had held. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could win a defensive victory that would buy time for diplomatic intervention. Then came April 1st, and with it came the full weight of Italian military power. At dawn, over 100 Italian aircraft appeared over Mechu. They came in waves, bombing Ethiopian positions systematically. There was no Ethiopian Air Force to contest them, no anti-aircraft guns to drive them away. The bombers flew low, dropping their payloads with terrible accuracy. High explosive bombs cratered defensive positions. Incendiary bombs started fires across the dry mountainsides. And then came the gas. Mustard gas bombs exploded across the Ethiopian lines, releasing their terrible poison. The gas drifted through trenches and defensive works, seeking out every hollow where men sheltered. Ethiopian soldiers, with no protection whatsoever, breathed in the toxic fumes. Their lungs burned, their skin blistered where the gas touched it. Eyes were seared, leaving men blind and helpless. Those who could still fight tried to hold their positions, but the gas made organized defense impossible. Units dissolved as men fled the contaminated areas, desperate for clean air. Behind the aerial bombardment came artillery, hundreds of guns firing in coordinated barrages. The Italian artillery had been positioned during the night, and now shells rained down on the Ethiopian positions. The combination of aerial bombs and artillery fire was overwhelming. Defensive works were obliterated. Communication lines were severed. Command and control broke down. Individual units fought on, isolated and surrounded by fire and poison. Emperor Haile Selassie watched his army disintegrate from his command post. Advisors urged him to flee while he still could. If captured, he would be paraded through Rome in chains, a trophy for Mussolini's imperial ambitions. The emperor resisted, wanting to stand with his men. But his counselors were insistent. Ethiopia needed him alive, needed him to carry their case to the world. Finally, reluctantly, Haile Selassie agreed to withdraw. Under cover of smoke and chaos, the emperor and a small escort fled Mechu. Behind them, the battle had become a rout. Ethiopian forces, their defensive positions destroyed, their formations shattered by gas and high explosive, retreated in disorder. Italian columns pursued, aircraft strafing the retreating Ethiopians mercilessly. Thousands died in the retreat. Thousands more were captured. The Battle of Mechu was over. Ethiopia's last army had been destroyed. Part 3. Conquest and Atrocity. The Road to Addis Ababa. After Mechu, organized Ethiopian resistance in the north collapsed. The road to Addis Ababa lay open, and Marshal Badoglio wasted no time. His mechanized columns advanced rapidly southward, covering in days distances that would have taken weeks in earlier colonial wars. Ethiopian forces, demoralized and leaderless after the loss of so many commanders, offered only sporadic resistance. Village after village fell to the Italian advance. The Italian columns were ruthless. Any village suspected of harboring resistance fighters was burned. Civilians caught fleeing were often shot. Badoglio had given orders that resistance was to be crushed absolutely, that examples were to be made. His soldiers followed these orders with enthusiasm. The march to Addis Ababa left a trail of destroyed villages and murdered civilians in its wake. Emperor Haile Selassie, arriving back in his capital, faced an impossible situation. His armies were destroyed. His nobles were scattered. The Italians were advancing unopposed. Foreign embassies were evacuating their staff. Even the Ethiopian treasury had been depleted, paying for weapons and supplies. The emperor called an emergency council of his remaining advisors and posed the
question that none wanted to answer. Should he stay in Addis Ababa and face capture, or should he flee to continue the fight from exile? The arguments were passionate. Some councillors urged the emperor to remain, to share the fate of his people, to die fighting if necessary. They argued that the emperor fleeing would demoralize the population, would be seen as abandonment. Others argued that the emperor alive in exile was worth more than the emperor dead or captured in Addis Ababa. From exile, he could plead Ethiopia's case to the League of Nations, could organize international support, could become a symbol of resistance rather than a captive trophy for Mussolini. Haile Selassie made the agonizing decision to leave. It was, he would later say, the hardest decision of his life. On May 2nd, 1936, the emperor and his immediate family boarded a train at Addis Ababa's railway station, bound for the port of Djibouti in French Somaliland. From there, they would take a ship to exile in Europe. As the train pulled away from the station, Haile Selassie looked back at his capital, not knowing if he would ever see it again. The emperor's departure threw Addis Ababa into chaos. With no central authority, discipline among remaining Ethiopian troops broke down. Some soldiers, knowing the war was lost, broke into storehouses seeking food and supplies. Others turned to looting. Shops were ransacked. Some foreign properties were damaged. The city descended into anarchy for several days, though most of the population remained peaceful, simply waiting in fear for what would come next. The fall of Addis Ababa, May 5, 1936. Italian forces entered Addis Ababa. Marshal Badoglio led his troops into the capital in a carefully choreographed entry, newsreel cameras capturing every moment for audiences back in Italy. Italian soldiers marched through the streets in perfect formation. Tanks rumbled past government buildings. Aircraft flew overhead in victory formations. The Italian flag was raised over the emperor's palace. Ethiopia's capital had fallen. In Rome, the news was greeted with euphoria. Crowds filled the streets celebrating. Church bells rang across the city. Mussolini appeared on his balcony at the Palazzo Venezia to address a massive cheering crowd. "Italy has her empire at last," he proclaimed. "After 15 centuries, the empire returns to the fatal hills of Rome." The crowd went wild. Mussolini announced that King Victor Emmanuel III was now Emperor of Ethiopia. The conquest that had taken 7 months was complete, or so it seemed. But conquest and occupation are different things. Italian forces controlled the cities and major roads, but vast stretches of Ethiopian countryside remained contested. In the mountains and remote valleys, Ethiopian resistance fighters, the Arbegnok or Patriots, continued to fight. They attacked Italian convoys, ambushed patrols, raided supply depots. The Italian response was savage. The occupation, terror and resistance. Marshal Badoglio, appointed as the first Italian viceroy of Ethiopia, instituted a regime of systematic terror. His orders were explicit: crush any resistance before it could organize, eliminate potential leaders, terrorize the population into submission. Italian forces carried out these orders with brutal efficiency. Ethiopian nobles and educated individuals were particular targets. Teachers, priests, government officials, anyone who might organize resistance was arrested. Many were executed without trial, often publicly to intimidate others. Badoglio believed that eliminating Ethiopia's educated class would prevent organized resistance from emerging. It was cultural genocide disguised as counterinsurgency. In rural areas, collective punishment became standard Italian policy. If resistance fighters operated in a region, entire villages would be destroyed. Livestock would be confiscated or killed. Wells would be poisoned. Crops would be burned. The message was clear: harbor resistance fighters and your village will cease to exist. These tactics, which would be recognized as war crimes today, were official Italian policy, directed from the highest levels of government in Rome. Despite the terror, resistance continued and even intensified. The Arbegnok operated in bands ranging from dozens to thousands of fighters. They knew the terrain intimately, could move through mountains where Italian trucks and tanks couldn't follow, and enjoyed support from local populations who saw them as heroes rather than bandits. The Italian occupation would never be secure, never be complete. Every day brought new ambushes, new attacks, new reminders that Ethiopia had not truly been conquered. The resistance fighters employed guerrilla tactics that frustrated Italian attempts to bring them to battle. They would strike suddenly, inflicting casualties, then disappear into the mountains before Italian reinforcements could arrive. They targeted isolated outposts, supply convoys on remote roads, Italian officials traveling without adequate security. The psychological impact was enormous. Italian soldiers could never feel safe, even in supposedly pacified areas. The Graziani Massacre, February 19, 1937. A ceremony was being held in Addis Ababa to celebrate the birth of the Prince of Naples, heir to the Italian throne. Viceroy Rodolfo Graziani, who had replaced Badoglio in June 1936, presided over the event. Hundreds of Ethiopians had been compelled to attend, along with Italian officials and soldiers. As Graziani distributed money to Ethiopian beggars as a gesture of Italian generosity, 2 Eritrean resistance fighters threw hand grenades at him. The explosion was devastating. Graziani was seriously wounded, along with several other Italian officials. Dozens of Ethiopians in the crowd were killed or injured by the blast. But the real horror began after the attack. Enraged Italian troops and fascist militia rampaged through Addis Ababa in an orgy of violence that lasted 3 days. They killed indiscriminately. Any Ethiopian man, woman, or child could be shot on sight, beaten to death, or burned alive in their homes. Entire neighborhoods were torched. Italian blackshirts, many drunk, roamed the streets with guns and clubs, hunting Ethiopians. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly. Conservative estimates suggest 3,000 killed, while other sources claim as many as 30,000 died in the massacre. The massacre extended beyond Addis Ababa. Graziani, recovering from his wounds, ordered systematic reprisals. He sent lists of suspected resistance sympathizers to be eliminated. Thousands more Ethiopians were arrested and executed without trial. Anyone associated with the former government, anyone educated, anyone who might pose a threat, all were targeted. It was genocide masquerading as security measures. The Debre Libanos massacre, the most horrific single atrocity, occurred at Debre Libanos Monastery, one of Ethiopia's holiest sites. The monastery was located in the region where the 2 Eritrean grenade throwers had come from. Graziani decided that the monastery must have been complicit in the attack. He ordered its destruction. On May 21, 1937, Italian troops surrounded Debre Libanos. Over 2,000 monks, deacons, and religious students were rounded up. They were marched to a ravine outside the monastery. There, Italian machine gunners executed them in groups, shooting until all were dead. The bodies were left in the ravine. The monastery itself was looted, then partially destroyed. The massacre at Debre Libanos was a war crime by any definition. It was the deliberate murder of non-combatants, of religious figures protected under all traditions of warfare, yet no one was ever prosecuted for it. Graziani would later be tried by the Italians after World War II, but only for crimes committed in Italy, not Ethiopia. He served a few months in prison and died peacefully in 1955. Continued resistance. Despite, or perhaps because of, Italian atrocities, Ethiopian resistance never ceased. The Arbegnach controlled large swaths of rural Ethiopia throughout the Italian occupation. In Gojam province, resistance fighters effectively prevented Italian forces from establishing permanent control. In the mountains of Shewa, patriot bands attacked Italian positions regularly. Even in areas nominally under Italian control, roads were unsafe, and Italian troops rarely ventured far from their fortified posts. The resistance had no central command, no unified strategy, but it had something perhaps more important: unwavering determination. Every Ethiopian who joined the Arbignoch knew they would likely die fighting the Italians. They fought anyway. They fought for their land, for their independence, for their dignity. They fought because surrender meant accepting occupation, and that was unacceptable. Italian casualties mounted steadily. Exact figures are difficult to determine, but hundreds of Italian soldiers and colonial troops were killed by resistance attacks during the occupation. Thousands more were wounded. The occupation required maintaining a massive military presence, over 200,000 troops at its peak, just to hold the territories Italy claimed to control. It was economically unsustainable, militarily exhausting, and morally indefensible. Part 4. The League of Nations fails. Haile Selassie's journey to Geneva. Emperor Haile Selassie arrived in exile first in Jerusalem, then in Bath, England, where he established a small court in exile. But his primary goal was to bring Ethiopia's case before the League of Nations. He spent weeks preparing, consulting with advisors, gathering evidence of Italian war crimes, and crafting his appeal. He knew this was Ethiopia's last chance for international intervention. The League scheduled a special session for June 30th, 1936, to address the Ethiopian crisis. By then, Ethiopia had already fallen, but Haile Selassie hoped the League might refuse to recognize the Italian conquest, might maintain sanctions, might provide support for Ethiopian resistance. He traveled to Geneva with a small delegation, determined to make the world hear Ethiopia's truth. The political situation was complex and discouraging. Britain and France, the League's most powerful members, had already indicated they would not take military action against Italy. Economic sanctions had been imposed in October 1935, but they were deliberately limited. Oil, the resource Italy needed most for its war machine, was not included in the sanctions. Britain and France feared that too strict sanctions might drive Italy into an alliance with Nazi Germany. They prioritized European power politics over collective security. June 30th, 1936. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. June 30th, 1936. The League of Nations Assembly Hall in Geneva. Delegates from 50 nations filled the chamber. In the gallery, journalists from around the world prepared to cover what would be one of the most significant speeches of the decade. And at the podium, a small, dignified figure in traditional Ethiopian dress prepared to address the assembly. As Emperor Haile Selassie began to speak in Amharic, Italian journalists in the gallery erupted in jeers and whistles, trying to shout him down. They shouted, "Duce! Duce!" They made catcalls. They threw insults. The emperor stood silently at the podium, waiting. The president of the assembly demanded order. Police removed the most disruptive Italian journalists. When quiet was finally restored, Haile Selassie began again. His speech, delivered calmly but with deep emotion, was a devastating indictment of Italian aggression and League failure. He described the Italian invasion in detail, the bombing of civilians, the use of chemical weapons, the deliberate targeting of hospitals and Red Cross stations. He held up photographs showing victims of mustard gas attacks. He read testimony from international observers confirming Italian war crimes. Special sprayers were installed on board aircraft so that they could vaporize over vast areas of territory a fine, death-dealing rain, Selassie told the assembly. Groups of 9, 15, 18 aircraft followed one another so that the fog issuing from them formed a continuous sheet. It was thus that, as from the end of January 1936, soldiers, women, children, cattle, rivers, lakes and pastures were drenched continually with this deadly rain. He detailed the destruction of Ethiopian hospitals, including those flying the Red Cross flag. He described Italian pilots deliberately targeting medical facilities, killing doctors and nurses, murdering wounded soldiers in their beds. These were clear violations of international law, of the Geneva Conventions, of every standard of civilized warfare. But Haile Selassie's speech went beyond documenting Italian crimes. He posed a question to the League, to the world. If international law could not protect Ethiopia, a League member attacked without provocation, then what was international law worth? If collective security failed in Ethiopia's case, how could any small nation trust in it? The emperor's most famous words came near the end of his speech. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." He was warning the League that Ethiopia was merely the first victim, that if aggression went unpunished, other nations would follow Italy's example. It was a prophetic warning. Within 3 years, the world would be at war. The League's response: abandonment. The speech was powerful, moving many delegates to tears, but it changed nothing. The League passed no significant resolutions. Economic sanctions, already ineffective, were lifted in July 1936. Britain and France recognized the Italian conquest. Haile Selassie's warnings were acknowledged but ignored. The League had failed its greatest test. The failure had multiple causes. Britain and France prioritized maintaining relationships with Italy over supporting collective security. They feared that aggressive action against Italy would drive Mussolini into Hitler's arms, a fear that proved well-founded as Italy and Germany formed the Rome-Berlin Axis in October 1936. The League also lacked enforcement mechanisms. Without a standing army, without member nations willing to fight, the League could only issue condemnations that aggressors ignored. But perhaps the deepest cause was racism. Ethiopia was an African nation. Its people were black, and many European leaders simply didn't believe that defending African sovereignty was worth risking European lives or interests. This casual racism permeated League discussions. Ethiopian suffering was regrettable, perhaps, but not important enough to disrupt European diplomacy. Haile Selassie left Geneva disappointed but not defeated. He would spend the next 5 years in exile in Bath, England, maintaining his court in exile, corresponding with resistance fighters in Ethiopia, and waiting for an opportunity to return. He never accepted the Italian conquest as legitimate. He never stopped considering himself Ethiopia's rightful emperor, and he never stopped believing that Ethiopia would be free again. The broader impact, the road to World War II. The Ethiopian crisis was a turning point in the march toward World War II. It demonstrated that the international order established after World War I had collapsed. Aggressor nations could attack their neighbors with impunity. The League of Nations, humanity's great experiment in collective security, was revealed as powerless. International law was meaningless without the will to enforce it. Hitler watched the Ethiopian crisis carefully. He saw that Britain and France would not fight to uphold League principles. He saw that aggression brought rewards, not punishment. In March 1936, while the world was focused on Ethiopia, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France protested but took no action. Hitler had learned the lesson of Ethiopia. Democratic nations would appease rather than confront. The tactics used in Ethiopia also spread. Italy had demonstrated that total war, targeting civilians, using chemical weapons, destroying entire communities, could achieve rapid victory. In Spain, during the civil war that began in July 1936, fascist forces employed these same tactics. The bombing of Guernica in April 1937, where German aircraft supporting Franco's fascists destroyed an entire town, was a direct continuation of Italian methods in Ethiopia. Most significantly, the Ethiopian crisis destroyed the credibility of collective security. Small nations could no longer trust that the international community would defend them. This made war more likely, not less, as nations felt they had to rely on their own military strength and alliances rather than international law. The world was reverting to the law of the jungle, where might made right and treaties were worthless. Part 5. Liberation and Legacy. Italy enters World War II, June 10, 1940. Benito Mussolini, watching Nazi Germany conquer France, decided that the war was essentially over and Italy must join before missing out on the spoils of victory. He declared war on Britain and France. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Italy was militarily unprepared, economically weak, and strategically overextended. Italian forces immediately attacked British positions in East Africa from their Ethiopian base. The attacks initially achieved some success. Italian forces captured British Somaliland in August 1940. But Britain was far from defeated. British forces in Kenya and Sudan were preparing for counter-offensives. More importantly, with Italy now an enemy, Britain had every reason to support Ethiopian resistance. The war gave Haile Selassie the opportunity he had been waiting for: Operation Compass and the East African Campaign. In January 1941, British and Commonwealth forces launched coordinated offensives into Italian East Africa from Kenya and Sudan. The Southern Force, advancing from Kenya, was led by Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham. The Northern Force, advancing from Sudan, was commanded by Lieutenant General William Platt. Both forces included significant numbers of Ethiopian Arbonok fighters who had been armed and supplied by the British. But the centerpiece of the liberation was the return of Emperor Haile Selassie himself. British military planners organized Mission 101, also known as the Gideon Force, specifically to support the Emperor's return. Led by Major Ord Wingate, an eccentric but brilliant British officer, the mission crossed into Ethiopia from Sudan with the Emperor in January 1941. Wingate understood that the Emperor's presence would rally Ethiopian resistance. As word spread that Haile Selassie had returned, thousands of Arbonok fighters emerged from the mountains to join his banner. What started as a small force of a few hundred grew to thousands, then tens of thousands. The Emperor was not coming back as a refugee seeking British protection. He was coming back as a liberator leading his people to freedom. The Italian collapse. The Italian position in East Africa was hopeless. Isolated from reinforcement or resupply from Italy, facing attacks from multiple directions, and confronted by a population that uniformly opposed them, Italian forces began to crumble. Ethiopian resistance attacks intensified dramatically with British support and the Emperor's return. Italian outposts were overrun, supply convoys were ambushed, morale collapsed. At Keren in Eritrea, Italian forces made a stand against General Platt's northern offensive. The battle, fought in rugged mountain terrain, lasted from February 3rd to April 1st, 1941. Italian defenders fought courageously, but they were overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. When Keren fell, the road to Asmara, Eritrea's capital, lay open. In the south, General Cunningham's forces advanced rapidly through Italian Somaliland and into southern Ethiopia. Italian resistance was sporadic and poorly coordinated. By February, Cunningham's forces had advanced hundreds of miles. The Italian Empire in East Africa was disintegrating. Wingate's Gideon Force, with Emperor Haile Selassie, advanced toward Addis Ababa from the northwest. Italian forces, demoralized and facing attacks from all sides, often surrendered without fighting. In town after town, Ethiopian civilians welcomed the Emperor's return with joy and celebration. The nightmare of occupation was ending. The Battle of Amba Alagi. The Duke of Aosta, Prince Amadeo of Savoy, commanded Italian forces in East Africa. He was a professional soldier, competent and honorable, very different from brutal commanders like Graziani. Recognizing that the situation was hopeless, Aosta withdrew to Amba Alagi. the same mountain where Italian forces had defeated Ethiopians in 1895. It was symbolically fitting. Italy's East African Empire would end where it had truly begun. Surrounded by British and Ethiopian forces, Aosta held out for 2 weeks in May 1941. His position was hopeless. No reinforcements would come, no relief was possible. But he maintained military discipline, treated his prisoners humanely, and conducted the defense according to accepted military codes. On May 17, 1941, recognizing further resistance was pointless and would only cause more casualties, Aosta surrendered. British forces treated Aosta with military honors, recognizing his professional conduct. He was taken prisoner and died of tuberculosis in British captivity in 1942. His surrender marked the effective end of Italian resistance in East Africa, though mopping-up operations would continue for several more months. May 5, 1941, the Emperor returns. May 5, 1941. Exactly 5 years after Italian forces entered Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie returned to his capital. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. Thousands of Ethiopians lined the streets, weeping, cheering, ululating traditional celebrations. Many fell to their knees as the emperor passed. Others danced in the streets. Children waved Ethiopian flags that had been hidden during the occupation. The emperor proceeded to his palace, which the Italians had occupied and looted. Standing before the crowd, Haile Selassie delivered a speech calling for reconciliation rather than revenge. He urged Ethiopians to treat Italian prisoners humanely, to not descend to the level of their former oppressors. It was a remarkable display of magnanimity from a man who had every reason to seek vengeance. Ethiopia's liberation was the first reversal of Axis conquest in World War II. It came before any Allied victories in Europe, before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, before the tide turned in North Africa. Ethiopia's freedom proved that fascist conquests could be reversed, that occupation was not permanent, that resistance and courage could ultimately triumph. For occupied nations across Europe, Ethiopia's liberation was a symbol of hope. The cost of war and occupation. The war and occupation had devastated Ethiopia. Casualty estimates vary widely due to limited record keeping, but conservative estimates suggest at least 275,000 Ethiopians died from combat, massacres and starvation between 1935 and 1941. Some historians believe the true toll may have been as high as 760,000, nearly 8% of Ethiopia's pre-war population. The Italian forces, by comparison, suffered approximately 10,000 combat deaths. Beyond the dead, the destruction was immense. Villages throughout Ethiopia had been burned. Agricultural production had been disrupted, leading to famines. Infrastructure, never extensive in Ethiopia, had been damaged or destroyed. Schools were closed, hospitals destroyed, and much of Ethiopia's educated class had been murdered during Graziani's reprisals. The cultural and economic damage would take decades to repair. The psychological scars went even deeper. An entire generation of Ethiopians had grown up during occupation, learning to fear and hate the Italians. The trauma of gas attacks, of seeing family members murdered, of living under constant terror affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Trust in international institutions was permanently damaged. Ethiopia would remain wary of foreign promises for generations. Post-war justice, the failure to prosecute. After World War II ended in 1945, war crimes trials were held at Nuremberg for German leaders and in Tokyo for Japanese leaders. Nazi and Japanese officials were prosecuted for crimes against humanity, including the use of chemical weapons, massacres of civilians, and aggressive warfare. Many were executed or imprisoned, but Italian war criminals faced no such justice. Though Britain compiled extensive evidence of Italian war crimes in Ethiopia, including the use of chemical weapons, massacres at Debre Libanos and Addis Ababa, and deliberate targeting of civilians. No international tribunal was convened. The political climate had changed. Italy had switched sides in 1943, joining the Allies against Germany. Britain and America wanted Italy as a stable, democratic ally in post-war Europe. Prosecuting Italian war criminals would destabilize Italian politics and might push Italy toward communism. Rodolfo Graziani, responsible for some of the worst atrocities, was tried by Italian courts in 1948, but only for collaborating with Nazi Germany after 1943, not for his crimes in Ethiopia or Libya. He was sentenced to 19 years in prison, but served only 4 months. He died peacefully in 1955, never having faced justice for the thousands he had murdered. Other Italian commanders who had used chemical weapons, who had ordered massacres, who had committed clear war crimes, were never prosecuted at all. This failure of justice sent a terrible message. War crimes against Africans did not warrant the same response as war crimes against Europeans. Italian atrocities in Ethiopia were conveniently forgotten, while German and Japanese atrocities were punished. The racism implicit in this double standard was obvious to Ethiopians and to colonized peoples worldwide. It reinforced the perception that international law was a tool of powerful nations, not a universal standard. Ethiopia's post-war role. Despite the trauma of invasion and occupation, Ethiopia emerged from World War II with enhanced international standing. Haile Selassie had been vindicated. His warnings at the League of Nations had proven prophetic. His courage in continuing the fight from exile and his leadership during liberation earned him respect from Allied leaders. In 1945, Ethiopia was one of the founding members of the United Nations, the new international organization that replaced the discredited League of Nations. Haile Selassie participated in the San Francisco Conference that established the UN Charter. For him, it was an opportunity to build the international order he had believed in before the League's failure. Ethiopia became a symbol for anti-colonial movements across Africa and Asia. If Ethiopia, black, African, without European protection, could resist colonialism and regain independence, so could others. After World War II, as European empires collapsed, African leaders looked to Ethiopia as a model. The country had maintained its sovereignty through millennia, resisted colonial conquest, and thrown off Italian occupation. It represented what other African nations aspired to achieve. In 1963, the Organization of African Unity was founded in Addis Ababa, with Haile Selassie playing a leading role. The OAU, precursor to today's African Union, chose Addis Ababa as its headquarters in recognition of Ethiopia's unique status as Africa's oldest independent nation. Haile Selassie became an elder statesman of African independence, respected across the continent. The lessons unheeded, yet the broader lessons of Ethiopia's invasion were largely ignored. The failure of collective security, so obvious in 1935-36, was repeated numerous times during the Cold War and beyond. Small nations continued to be invaded by larger neighbors, while the international community failed to intervene effectively. The pattern established in Ethiopia: strong condemnations but weak actions, economic sanctions that didn't prevent aggression, diplomatic protests that changed nothing, repeated across decades. The use of chemical weapons in Ethiopia should have been a bright red line, but it wasn't. Chemical weapons were used in Yemen in the 1960s, in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and in Syria in the 2010s. The prohibition on chemical weapons, violated so flagrantly by Italy in Ethiopia, proved to have little deterrent effect when nations decided their interests justified using them. The targeting of civilians, perfected by Italy in Ethiopia, became standard practice in subsequent conflicts. World War II saw massive civilian casualties from aerial bombardment, Tokyo, Dresden, Hiroshima. The principle that civilians should be protected in warfare, already weakened in Ethiopia, collapsed entirely. Modern warfare accepts civilian casualties as inevitable, even when they are deliberately inflicted. Perhaps most disturbingly, the impunity enjoyed by Italian war criminals set a precedent. Leaders who commit atrocities often escape justice, especially if they represent nations that are strategically important to major powers. Justice, it seems, depends less on the severity of crimes than on the geopolitical importance of the perpetrators. This cynical reality, so evident in the failure to prosecute Italian war criminals, continues to shape international relations. Haile Selassie's complex legacy. Emperor Haile Selassie ruled Ethiopia from his return in 1941 until he was deposed in a military coup in 1974. His later reign was increasingly autocratic and out of touch with his people's needs. A famine in 1973–74, which Selassie attempted to hide from the world, cost over 200,000 lives and destroyed what remained of his legitimacy. He died in 1975, possibly murdered by the revolutionary government. Yet his role during the Italian invasion and his speech at the League of Nations remain historically significant. Selassie stood before the world and warned them of catastrophe to come. He articulated principles of collective security and international law that remain relevant today. His courage in continuing the fight from exile and his leadership during liberation earned him a place among the 20th century's most important leaders. Selassie became an icon far beyond Ethiopia. In Jamaica and the Caribbean, the Rastafarian movement venerated him as a divine figure, seeing in his resistance to colonialism a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. While Selassie himself was a devout Ethiopian Orthodox Christian who never claimed divinity, the Rastafarian reverence for him reflected his symbolic importance as a black leader who had stood up to European imperialism and won. Modern Ethiopia and memory. Today, Ethiopia remembers the invasion and occupation through monuments, museums, and annual commemorations. May 5th is celebrated as Liberation Day, marking the emperor's return to Addis Ababa. Monuments to the Arbegnok resistance fighters stand throughout the country, honoring those who never surrendered. The memory of Italian atrocities remains strong in Ethiopian consciousness. Older Ethiopians can still recall stories passed down from those who lived through the occupation. The use of chemical weapons, the massacres, the systematic brutality of Italian rule are part of Ethiopian national identity, a source of pain but also of pride that Ethiopia survived and ultimately prevailed. Relations between Ethiopia and Italy remain complex. Italy has never formally apologized for the invasion or its war crimes. Attempts to address the historical legacy have been minimal. Some Italian historians and public figures have acknowledged the atrocities, but there has been no official government recognition or reparations. For many Ethiopians, this failure to acknowledge crimes and accept responsibility remains a source of resentment. Conclusion: the warning we ignored. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia was more than a colonial war. It was a preview of World War II, a demonstration of the totalitarian tactics that would devastate Europe, and a test of international institutions that they catastrophically failed. Everything that shocked the world in 1939 to 1945 had been previewed in Ethiopia in 1935 to 1936. The aerial bombing of civilians, the use of chemical weapons, the targeting of hospitals, the systematic terrorizing of populations, and the complete disregard for international law. Haile Selassie's warning, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow," proved tragically accurate. Ethiopia was the first victim, but not the last. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Poland, and ultimately all of Europe would follow. The international community's failure to stop Italy in Ethiopia emboldened every would-be aggressor. It taught Hitler that Britain and France would not fight to uphold international law. It taught Mussolini that aggression brought rewards. It taught small nations that they could not trust in collective security. The invasion of Ethiopia was also a story of extraordinary courage and resistance. The Ethiopian warriors who charged Italian machine guns knowing they would die. The Armagnac who fought for 5 years, never surrendering despite overwhelming odds. The emperor who believed in international law even when it failed him, who never accepted defeat, who led his people back to freedom. These acts of courage deserve to be remembered alongside the tragedy. In the end, Ethiopia's story is one of resilience. The ancient kingdom was invaded, occupied, traumatized, but not broken. It regained its independence. It rebuilt its institutions. It became a symbol for African resistance to colonialism. The Italy that invaded Ethiopia no longer exists. The fascist regime collapsed in 1943, but Ethiopia endures, its independence maintained, its sovereignty restored, its pride intact. As we look back nearly 90 years later, the invasion of Ethiopia remains relevant. It reminds us that international law is only as strong as the will to enforce it, that collective security fails when powerful nations prioritize their interests over principles, that aggression unpunished leads to more aggression, that courage and resistance matter even against overwhelming odds, and that small nations deserve the same protection under international law as powerful ones. The road to World War II began in the highlands of Ethiopia in October 1935. The warning signs were clear, the failures were obvious, but the world did not listen. We paid for that failure with over 60 million lives lost in World War II. The question that haunts us is, have we learned the lessons of Ethiopia, or are we doomed to repeat them? The answer will determine whether Haile Selassie's warning, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow," remains a historical footnote or becomes a prophecy fulfilled once more.